Hey, there we go. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. You made it through the week. My name is Bryan with the Food Leadership Group here in beautiful Colorado, where it's going to be a really, really nice day today. Our guest, Dr. Goodrich, is having a and myself. There we go. Awesome. Morning, Larry. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Well, first off, let me start with an apology. So, as I mentioned to everybody here, we're having a bit of technical issues. Who was the person responsible for the technical issues? Me. I was responsible. Um, so as you do these live streams, you kind of get in the habit of doing certain things at certain times, and we have like a prep call earlier in the week and things like that. And there's a meeting invite with the link for these webinars that needs to take place and get updated. And I didn't do that. And I didn't send the link to Dr. Goodrich. And so this morning I'm like, oh crap. And so sorry, Larry. That's completely my fault. Hopefully you didn't have to scramble around too much.
No, it's okay.
Good. So how's your Friday going so far?
Not too bad. Not too bad at all.
Good. So on Friday, so for new people who are joining us, every Friday we get together here on LinkedIn and YouTube and do a live stream on food safety. And I bring in an expert in the field and we talk all things food safety. And one of the things you'll notice with our chat here is this isn't a presentation, right, where we're just giving you a bunch of information and we take a few questions at the end. This is meant to be interactive, and that's really the fun part of it. And what I really enjoy this because, as we all know, food safety is not a point of competition. It's something that we all have to work on together to improve, because as we are all acutely aware, especially with a lot of the issues that are going on right now, that food safety is not a point of competition. One business is impacted by another, regardless of whether or not they have food safety systems in place that are good. So we need to make sure and do that. So as I had mentioned, I'm calling in for this live stream from Colorado. Dr. Goodrich is in beautiful Ontario at the University of Guelph. How's the weather looking up there? Is it pretty nice now, or?
Yeah, today's actually not too bad. It's been unseasonably cool
Mhm.
for the summer, but I think today we're gonna have a good day.
Absolutely. So yeah, here in Colorado, over the weekend, record highs. They're saying around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So yeah, so it's going to be a warm one. So good morning. Nice to see you, Frank, and your smiling face. Lance, good to see you as well. Ryan, good. And my assistant Renee is on, and he's going to be putting up some links in here. One of the things that I'm going to be handing out here at the end is there's a webinar I'm doing next week with Trace Kane. So we're going to be giving you guys the link to that free webinar on a subject we'll talk about later. So today we're kind of, this is a fun one today. And what's really cool about this is with food safety is if you work in this space in any capacity, and Larry knows this really well as well, is that things constantly change. And if you're not keeping up to date on the latest things, you're going to find yourself behind very, very quickly. So with that, we're going to kind of have a discussion here, and definitely today we're really looking for audience participation as well. What are those issues out there that are really catching your attention? What are the recent outbreaks that are really up high on your list? I mean, so for me, Larry, one of those outbreaks that is really caught my attention here in the U.S., and I'm sure this is impacted in Canada as well, is the peanut butter issue with Jif. How's that impacting you guys in Canada?
So far we haven't. It doesn't seem to be impacting us.
Oh.
I haven't seen. I've not seen any recall notices or any indication of illnesses. So it'll be something that's really interesting to see, because I would expect a well-known brand like Jif
Mhm.
would have had product shipped to Canada, but it's interesting. I've not seen that.
Yeah, I mean, because when the last big peanut butter issue had with Peanut Corporation of America, that was used, a lot of industrial applications, and it went everywhere.
Hmm.
And you're right, we've seen some things. We've seen some ancillary recalls for Smuckers, where they're like doing ingredients in like their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and some other products. But you're right. I mean, it's not nearly as much as you would expect. Um, hmm. I wonder if it's because maybe they keep it internally more than anything else within their own organization. So Smucker owns Jif. So that's a good point. It's very curious. Wonder
Well,
why.
you know, um, just looking at the current alert from CDC, which hasn't been updated. It really hasn't been updated lately, and they're saying 16 illnesses across 12 states. So very wide in terms of the number of states, but small in terms of the number of illnesses, at least thus far. So
Interesting. I wonder if maybe the potential with the salmonella that's in the product, maybe it's a low dosage in there or something like that. Oh, it wasn't. It was environmental, but come to think of it, was it? Does it say in there, Larry, whether or not that was Listeria or Salmonella?
Salmonella.
Salmonella, right? Yeah. So one of the things that's really difficult with Salmonella when you have it in your plant environment, it's really hard to get rid of once it's there. So when you find it, you definitely have to eradicate it really, really quickly. And so I'm kind of doing a look here on the Food Industry Council search for food recalls, which is an excellent site, by the way, if you're new to this call and you haven't seen this yet. It's foodindustrycouncil.com. And then you can search recalls, which is amazing because if you've used here in the US FDA's system for looking at recalls, it's really hard to find what you're looking for. So yeah, let's see. So a bakery, a protein powder snack had some salmonella. I don't think that's related to the Jif though. Giant Eagle, yeah, not a whole lot. So it looks like 1, 2, 3, only 3 in June. None in July. So hopefully this thing is dying down.
Yeah, one can hope. I mean, if hopefully they should have gotten most of it off the off the shelf. And I'm going to correct myself. It turns out that there was a recall in Canada.
Oh, was there? What was it? What was it for? Was it an ingredient or?
No, it was the this Jif, just peanut butter.
Interesting. Okay, so they shipped it up there directly and they're pulling it back.
Yeah.
Well, that's good that they caught it.
I had missed that, but it's I think they probably got it all. This is that notice, which was a very short one, was in late May. So
yeah. Oh, good for them then that they caught this. I mean, that's an indicator of good systems and that they have good traceability. They were able to lock it down. They found it pretty quickly. So good. I mean, so it's really easy to criticize on these type of things, but sometimes food companies are able to respond quickly. So thumbs up. Good job.
I just want to bring up something in the introduction. You said that, which is something that I think most people in the industry would agree with, which is that food safety is not a competitive issue.
Mm-hmm.
But I've often wondered if that's actually the case. I think in some cases it actually can be a competitive issue because if you have, we all know in any given industry there are companies that are very progressive and really try to stay at the leading edge of food safety innovation. And we know that there are still companies who view this as a necessary evil. And I just wonder if for those companies that are progressive and really understand and really try to improve their food safety systems, does that not provide them a potentially a competitive advantage over companies who do not do that in terms of, I mean, certainly when there's we'll take this recall. Yes, that will affect this. I think it's Smuckers. Is it Smuckers that makes it? So that'll affect the company, but it'll also affect the larger. We've seen this, right? It'll affect the entire industry. Right. But at the end of the day, Smuckers, the brand, will take a hit. So, I'm not implying that they did not follow food safety, protocols, but I just wonder if in a hypothetical situation where there is some kind of outbreak and it occurs in a company that has not been following those protocols, then for companies within the same industry that have, does that not provide them a potential competitive advantage?
Right. Well, I mean, you make a good point. I mean, part of this is, and everybody, please let us know in the comments what you think, right? Because there's two sides to this coin. Because part of it, we never see advertisements in company. It's like, hey, we're company ABC. our food safety doesn't suck, right? It's kind of just something that's assumed, right? We as Americans and Canadians, and we have good food safety systems, and we just automatically assume it's a given that the food is safe. And when that trust is broken, I think it impacts that entire section. And so my thoughts around that is a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to the companies, but they say pay attention to the product. So let's say, for example, Sprouts, right? So people hear, God, I love Sprouts on my salad, but I'm hearing all this information that Sprouts are dangerous. I'm just going to stop eating Sprouts. People don't go that next step and say, okay, I'll find a good company that makes Sprouts and I'll just buy from them. I'll get a copy of their last audit and whatever else. It's hard from the consumer side to figure out those type of parameters. I don't know. Does that make sense? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so on that note, I've been critical of. I mean, you brought up fresh produce, so I've been critical in the fresh produce industry. Like when there's outbreaks, there's been this movement towards traceability and labeling to be able to say, well, you know, we'll take romaine lettuce. This romaine lettuce came from this producer, in this state. So don't buy romaine lettuce from this producer in this state, but everything else is fine.
Right.
I've been critical of that from a public health standpoint because, as you've said, I don't think consumers pay attention to who produced what or even remember. I mean, certainly in our family, my wife does the majority of the grocery shopping. She would never remember, well, it was this company that did. So I think that is it's not helpful from a public health standpoint because people could forget.
Right.
And if they go into a grocery store or other retail and that product has not yet been removed, because we know sometimes it's not in some retail operations is not removed as fast as others, then they could inadvertently be buying product that makes them sick. But my point about the competitiveness referred to the fact that there are some people, I think, who are perhaps more well informed, and if they were to, if they know, well, here's this recall, it's with this particular brand, would that make them decide that going forward they would no longer buy it from that brand, but perhaps buy it from another brand that was not implicated? I was just wondering about that.
Well, that's a good question. I guess my answer on that, I'd be curious to see what other people think, but my answer, I haven't seen any studies like that. That could be a very interesting research paper of consumer perceptions relative to brand loyalty and recalls within a category. So do people, once they see that, just say, all right, fine, I'm not buying anything from that again, I'm done, I don't want to get sick? Or do they take it to that next level? It's a good question.
Yeah, and I think certainly on the first part, I certainly know anecdotally that your first answer, or question, do they say I'm not buying any of that, I think is true. I remember when I still lived in the US, I think it was 2012 cantaloupe outbreak in Colorado, and linked just to specific type of cantaloupe grown specifically in Colorado. And I still had friends ask me, and I explained that to them, and comments were, well, I'm not buying any cantaloupes from anywhere, because who knows, right? So I definitely think there are lots of people who would say, I'm not buying anything, I'm not buying any of that commodity regardless of who produced it. But I also think consumers are becoming increasingly more sophisticated in their food choices, and we're seeing this more and more information, Q codes being placed on labels because consumers want more information, where was their food produced, and so forth. So I just wonder if within that specific aspect, if it is in fact a possibility that food safety could become a competitive advantage, not because a company would advertise that, but because by not following food safety protocols, the company puts themselves at increased risk of recalls or contamination, which, if that happens, it would become publicly known, and then customers would move away from that brand.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, so Jill has a good comment here. So great point on the competitiveness. I tend to agree with you. Companies are still hesitant to share details. How often are companies sharing CCP failure data? Never. What happened? What were the risk assessments? And how would we expect this confidential information to be shared? And I think, and this is something, Larry, that we've talked about on this chat before, is there's kind of this wall of secrecy, for lack of a better term, where an issue happens, right? There's a big recall that happens. There's all kinds of flurries of activities, things are removed, and it may make them media or not. And then it goes away. And as food safety professionals, to Jill's point, we're like, okay, well, what happened? Why did this happen? What corrective actions were put in place? What did the investigation reveal? And what can I learn from that to keep that from happening in my operations? That piece is right. Nope, because people just want to move on.
Well, I also think it's the fear of current and future litigation.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So if a company admits that they had a breakdown in their HACCP, um, then, by definition, they're liable.
Mm-hmm.
So but also in the future, so even if nobody was sick, and let's just say 5 years from now, you know, something happens. One could point backwards and say, well, 5 years ago they had a breakdown in their CCP. I mean, this is one of the for the listeners. I think this is one of the concerns with the FDA's genome tracker.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever talked about. Have you talked about that?
A little bit, but yeah,
A little.
let's go over that. Yeah, it's a great topic.
So genome tracker is a database that's developed by the FDA to track the presence of foodborne pathogens in the food production environment using whole genome sequencing. And so one like various labs around the country, even companies can register with the FDA and deposit the whole genome sequences of isolates that they found in their plant or in food or in the food processing environment on the site. But there's been a lot of concern on the part of the food industry, um, because and hesitation to do exactly that because of the thinking that if then subsequent contamination is discovered in the plant and the genomic sequence is the same as one that was placed there, you know, um, previously, then that could be used to establish that there was an ongoing problem in that
Mm-hmm.
plant and therefore increase the culpability of the company. So, um, I think that fear of litigation is a major reason why we don't see um, that information being shared widely.
Mm-hmm. No, and that makes sense. And we've seen this in past cases, and this is pretty much standard protocol for FDA. If they go into a facility now and they have an issue, they will, if they decide that they need to do a swabathon, they're going back and comparing to that database and looking at cold cases from years ago. And I understand from the Bluebell ice cream issue in Texas, they linked up previous cases from years prior to that.
Yeah,
So, kind of devil's advocate on that type of thing. If you think your company is being protected by not talking about this information, well, FDA has kind of found a way around that, right? and one of the first things that FDA does, if they're looking at potentially investigating you in a criminal case with the Department of Justice, they're going to subpoena your emails. Right? And with Mr. Cruz, the former CEO of Bluebell, who's currently undergoing what seems like forever, right, getting his trial going on this, he's not being charged with the listeria issue itself and the contamination in the plants. He's being charged with conspiracy and fraud across interstate lines because of the emails he sent regarding communication with customers, right? So I think that's something with FSMA that has really changed the rules of the game, Larry, and people don't really realize it. Everything within your company relative to food safety is essentially now an open book. If there's an issue, FDA can go in and look at all of that stuff. So your prerequisites, your preventive controls, your systems, and everything else. So if you have an issue, FDA is going to find it out. And if you're not actively doing things to correct that, they're going to come down on you harder. So I think it's going to be, and I hope we see this in future years, is a shift in how we look at these type of things so that we can approach this more collectively, for lack of a better word, and try and look at these things. Because one of the things that everybody always looks back at is the Tylenol case and why that was a successful mitigation of a risk in the marketplace. And it's because Tylenol and Bayer, who was it, Bayer who owned the company, or was it Johnson and Johnson? I think it was Johnson and Johnson. They were very open and public and say, hey, somebody messed with our pills and there's potential pills on the shelf. And just to make sure everybody's safe, we're pulling everything right now. To your point, that wasn't an internal failure on their part, but they did a really, really good job of getting out in front of it. And those cases where companies did that are few and far between.
Yep.
So that would be an interesting approach, right? Because a lot of times, and as somebody who's been on the inside for a long time, I see this, right? So when the lawyers get involved, right, the lawyer's initial response is protect the company. And that may not always be the correct response. So one of the things that Larry and I were looking at, good mute on the cough, by the way. That was perfect.
Thank you.
And it's just these weird food safety things that pop up every now and then. So someone had asked me recently, okay, Bryan, all this food safety stuff is fun. What are some things that you don't eat? And Bill Marler's pretty famous for putting out the list of foods that he won't eat. And one of those is like bivalves, mollusks, and things like that, because you have a lot of issues with like eating raw shellfish and things like this, clams and what have you. And there's a weird one that Larry and I were looking at in Florida that I'm sure has come across a lot of people here in the chat. Let us know on this if you've seen this. Is giant snails, right? Invasive species coming into the country, and this is what down in Florida.
Yeah, it's in Florida. In one specific county, I think it's Pasco County. And they found these giant African land snails, which are invasive, and this is a big problem because these snails, an individual snail apparently can lay over 2,000 eggs, and so it's very difficult to eradicate. The last time this was found in Florida, it took them 10 years to eradicate these snails. So your listeners might say, well, that's nice, but what does that have to do with food safety? Well, it's interesting because these snails can carry a parasite that causes a disease called rat lung worm disease. And this is a disease that's not common at all in North America. Typically common in places like Asia, but it has occurred in some places in the U.S., for example, Hawaii. And what happens is that the parasite is carried by rats and shed in their feces, and then snails can come along and ingest that parasite, and people can get it from eating snails, either deliberately or inadvertently, or not just the snails, but like if somebody eats unwashed lettuce or other raw leafy greens that have been contaminated by the slime of infected snails or slugs, then people can get ill. And most times the illness will be mild. In many cases, people might not even know they have it, but in some cases, it can cause meningitis.
Wow.
And in some cases, in some rare cases, it can be fatal. So, so this is interesting, in that the concern about these, snails in Florida is precisely that it could spread this rat lungworm disease.
Well, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, right? So you got this nasty, and right, yeah, I saw a picture online, right, and then, like, these things were like sitting in somebody's hand. They were huge, and yeah, let's say these guys are in a field of produce, right, running around munching on that, and they're doing these slime trails around on the leaves of the lettuce or what have you, and then you go and you harvest it. You have no idea it's there. And your existing processes may clean it, but it doesn't really sound like it. So a good example of your processes and how you're managing food safety under USDA or FDA, it doesn't matter. You need to be looking at new threats all the time. So if you're a produce manufacturer and you're in Florida, you need to be looking at this.
Yeah, apparently these are some people keep them as pets, and then they inadvertently escape, and away we go. So,
like these giant African frogs and all these other weird
yes,
things that get out.
yes.
So weird. Austin has a question for us. Thanks for the question, Austin. What is the difference between PulseNet at the CDC and Genome Tracker with FDA?
Good question. So, PulseNet at the CDC, which is actually called PulseNet USA, and there's a whole global network of PulseNet. So here in Canada, we have PulseNet Canada. PulseNet Canada and PulseNet USA work extremely closely together because obviously we ship food across the border. So there's the potential for international outbreaks in Canada and the US. So what PulseNet is responsible for is identifying outbreaks. So the way it works is if you're in Colorado, let's say you ate some peanut butter, and then somebody in Florida also ate some peanut butter at the same time. You both got sick with salmonella, specific serotype. You both went to your doctors. They took cultures, and it came back positive. So then that would be characterized. The whole genome sequence would be determined, and it would be uploaded to the PulseNet database. And PulseNet, what it does is it searches for similar sequences for a given microorganism. So then those two hits would come up, and that would indicate that there's a potential outbreak, because an outbreak is two or more sick individuals that have consumed the same food at the same time. So that is how outbreaks are largely identified across the country. So that's what CDC does. Genome Tracker is just more of a monitoring tool. Where sequences, I don't believe there are any clinical sequences there. I think these are mainly food and environmental sequences, whole genome sequences of bacteria from the food production environment and associated environments that are uploaded to the FDA Genome Tracker database, and that can be used to track their presence. In some cases, you said over years.
Right. And what's interesting too, then, is kind of these solutions too that the market has put in place. So these different websites that you can go to if you've been sick and put in the information. So was it like iwaspoisoned.com, those type of places. And you start seeing things emerging there that may be an issue or not. So one that was recently popped up, and I haven't seen anything new on this, so I'll be curious to see if anybody in the chat has, is Lucky Charms. Right, all the people reading Lucky Charms, reporting these weird symptoms, getting nauseous, vomiting, and things like this. A lot of reports, and there was no recall, and it just kind of went away. I haven't heard anything new. Have you heard anything on that, Larry?
Well, so if I recall, I think people had been reporting their symptoms on a website called iwaspoisoned.com. I think so. And that caused an investigation by the FDA, but I've not heard anything since then.
That's always the interesting thing, isn't it? When you see these things happen, and then you're like, what the heck, right? They just kind of disappear. And again, that's the consumer side of things, right? So if you're the manufacturer of Lucky Charms, how do you handle that, right? Then from a communication and a PR standpoint, obviously there's a lot of consumers, and this is a product that's marketed toward children, right? As adults, right? We ate it plenty when we were younger. And moms get concerned about these type of things. So I haven't seen any follow-up communication on that from the company at all.
So I'm just checking this. So again, this is as of May the 12th. So as of May the 12th, there were 555 complaints of, well, 555 potential illnesses associated with this. And the website I was poison.com received more than 7,300 reports of people saying they had classic food poisoning symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea after eating Lucky Charms. So, well, now one of the problems, this iwaspoison.com website is quite interesting. I don't know if your readers are aware of that site.
A little bit, yeah.
So this is a site where anybody can go and just post what they think are, if they feel that they've been sickened after eating food, they can go and post there. I'm not a big fan of the website for a number of reasons. Number one, we know for a lot of foodborne pathogens, the incubation period, the time from between consumption and illness can vary, can be days, weeks, even months long. So, people tend to think if they wake up today and they have diarrhea, it must be the chicken they ate last night, when it could have been the salad they ate 5 days ago. So, I'm not sure about the scientific veracity of those claims. The other thing is there's no real way to authenticate what people say. So anybody can go and post anything on that site. And I know in the past there's been concern about stock manipulation of given food companies. Like if you want to affect the stock of a food company, a large number of people could suddenly post that or a restaurant or whatever the case may be, that they've eaten there and had problems. So those are my concerns with that site. Now, having said that, this appears to be valid. A large number of reports, and a large number of potential illnesses, and the FDA is investigating, but I've not seen anything or any update on that, as you've said.
Interesting. Yeah, you bring up a good point, because it just kind of it shows just how difficult it must be to work in epidemiology, right? Looking for these trends and trying to figure these things out and doing it as quickly as possible. Because a lot of this is anecdotal, and anybody who's worked in food safety in the food industry knows this really well. Is, hey, I ate your product and made me sick. Okay, how do we know that, right? To your point, people always associate with the last thing that you ate. And it gets down to infective dose, vulnerability, all these type of different factors. One of the things that just absolutely fascinates me with salmonella is quorum sensing, where salmonella will actually hang out in your gut until there's enough cells there to attack you. And that can take a long time, right? And it shows that sophistication, right? These organisms have been around for billions of years, right? And they know how to attack us. And that can really cause issues tracking this stuff down. So a lot of this too, right, is when FDA gets a random report on something, they may not necessarily act right away either, because they're looking for a trend. So one person says I'm ill, and they're kind of like, well, okay, we'll keep an eye on that. But once 2 or 3 people start coming in with the same symptoms from the same plant and these type of things, now all of a sudden you've got their attention, and then they're going to probably come in and do an investigation. But the stock piece of it, I hadn't thought about that. That's a brilliant observation, right? So if I want to short the stock of General Mills, I start a campaign to go to I Was Poisoned and have a bunch of my buddies through my linkages go in there and report false issues. Yeah, because they're, to your point, Larry, they're completely unverifiable. Were they really sick? It's somebody saying they were sick, but were they really sick?
Absolutely.
And the other part of this that's really difficult is, as relatively healthy people, if I get food poisoning, I just tough it out. I'm not going to the doctor and report it and have samples, have me poked and prodded and here, do this in this cup or whatever. Nobody wants to do that. So that information on that side becomes very limited too. in that the people who are most susceptible, let's say that somebody gets food poisoning from salmonella and it puts them in the hospital. Well, then, yeah, FDA is going to see that.
Right. So let's talk about that. What you just said. So absolutely. So it's called the pyramid of surveillance.
Mm.
And any disease actually, but we're talking about foodborne diseases. So in countries like the USA, Canada, countries in Europe, Australasia, countries with robust surveillance systems, the majority of the surveillance is really done using this pyramid of surveillance, which is a pyramid, and so at the bottom of the pyramid are people who become exposed. Okay, so let's say we ate some lettuce or something that was contaminated, um, and so a certain group of people are exposed, but not everybody who's exposed will get sick. There's a
Mm-hmm.
number of reasons for that. So on the second rung on the pyramid is the number of the people who get sick. Now, as you just said, most people who get sick with a foodborne illness do not go to the hospital.
Right.
If you don't go to the hospital, public health officials don't know about you. So, but some people will. So the third rung on the pyramid is, and it's a pyramid, right? It starts wide at the bottom and it goes to the right. So let at the bottom were the number of people who were infected or exposed. Let's say 1,000 people, right? The next one up, the number of people who got actually infected. So let's say 700 people. Then the next one up is the number of people who go to the hospital. Let's say maybe 100 people, right? Um, so then when you go to the hospital, the medical professor has to take a culture, a stool culture typically. But many times they'll say, well, you have a foodborne illness, go home, it'll resolve itself in a few hours. So if a stool culture is not taken, the public health officials still don't know about you.
Mm.
Stool culture has to yield the causative agent of the infection, but no test is infallible, so sometimes that won't happen. Even when it does happen, it has to be reported to the health department. And in times like now, we're in a pandemic with COVID. People staff are short.
Mm.
There's other things that are more pressing, that may go unreported. Um, it may never be reported, or it may go unreported for weeks or months. So all this to say that it generally takes 3 to 4 weeks after somebody has consumed a contaminated food before public health officials know about it.
Mm-hmm.
And all that time, the food is in circulation in retail. Additional people are buying that and getting sick, and so forth. So I bring this up because I actually am doing a project right now to modernize how we do surveillance.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that the pyramid of surveillance is a passive system. It relies on the sick person to go seek help. What we're trying to do is make the surveillance into an active surveillance program that takes completely removes the sick person. And the way we're doing that is by monitoring wastewater
Uh-huh.
for
Oh.
raw wastewater for the presence of the pathogen. It's shed in feces. You have diarrhea is a common, foodborne illness symptom. Um, so we're trying to develop a program where we monitor wastewater in cities. Like it could
Mhm.
be Denver, it could be Fort Collins, it could be Toronto, it could be wherever. And if you see the signal of a given pathogen above what we determine to be a baseline, that could mean that there's an outbreak. And so the problem with wastewater surveillance is that um, now we know that there could be an outbreak in Toronto or wherever, but we don't know who. And so we are trying to combine the wastewater surveillance with a method called social media syndromic surveillance. So it's interesting because a lot of people will not go to the hospital when they're sick, but they share their symptoms on social media.
Wow.
And in the US, over the last 10 years or so, a number of jurisdictions have been using social media syndromic surveillance to try to identify foodborne outbreaks earlier than than is currently possible. So we want to combine both of those types of surveillance to develop a new active surveillance approach, which we think, if successful, would reduce the time that public officials would know about the outbreak from 3 to 4 weeks, maybe down to 1 week or so.
Wow, that's really cool. That's a really neat idea. So it's kind of like, so within COVID, right? So different countries would set up thermal cameras in airports, right, looking for people with temperatures, right? So they're not actually going up to every person and saying, "Hey, do you have a fever?" No. Okay, next person. Do you have a fever? Right? They're actually just using that technology to monitor that process. Hmm.
And
And you're
and,
right.
and
Yeah, on social media, people will be like, "Yeah, hey, can't make it to dinner. I feel really bad."
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and actually the wastewater idea, we'd started it just before uh, COVID pandemic,
Mhm.
but it has become, the approach right now to monitor COVID, because COVID also, people shed it in their feces, so it gets into the wastewater. And given the incredibly high numbers of people who have COVID, it's no longer feasible to accurately determine what's going on from individual PCR tests.
Mhm.
So wastewater has really taken off. And in Ontario here, we have actually a provincial network where we test the wastewater in cities all across the province of Ontario 3 times a week for COVID, and that's how we know, for example, that we are now entering another wave, because the signal is going up, and we're seeing that.
Wow.
So I think that wastewater surveillance is something that can be quite useful, in terms of the food safety arena, and improving the way we do surveillance.
Hmm. Well, yeah, that's really good too, because I mean, so part of it, yeah, is when we go through a pandemic like this and you have high levels of COVID, there's other things going on, right? So salmonella, listeria, and everything else that get hidden in that noise. And to
Yes.
your point, resource allocation, right?
Yes.
So it's like, the government is like, oh, COVID, all right, all hands on deck, COVID. Once we can travel, we'll start going and visiting plants and doing investigations again. But in the meantime, let's focus on this. But salmonella doesn't stop, and listeria doesn't stop, and those things still continue, and they just get masked. So this
Yeah.
could be a really cool way. Um, Part of this too, with these type of public identified issues as well too, is, as we were talking here, Larry, there's a couple things I thought of, is outside influence as well. So the media, right? The media is always looking for the next big story, right? It's like, Ebola, swine flu, and all these type of things, right? And now it's what, monkeypox, right? It's monkeypox, right? Because those type of things cause people to click on stories, right? So they're
Yes.
always looking for those type of things. So something that may not be a major issue, all of a sudden is perceived as a major issue by the public, and then people start running around going, they're doing this and going, "Oh my God, I think I've got monkeypox," right? And then they're clogging up the system with things like that, and it may or may not be true, but they're perceiving it to be true.
Hmm.
The other side of it too is political, right? So a particular politician may decide that they want to jump on an issue because, let's say that there's manufacturing facilities in a neighboring state that are competing with businesses in their state. And so they're going to go out there and talk about these issues, about this bad player in those areas, and cause influences in those areas as well too, right? So all kinds of influences that can impact that public perception of food safety.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Interesting. I mean, we definitely see this in infant formula. I mean, so
Hmm.
when you hear, and I hear this in different radio shows and whatever things I listen to, right, is that, hey, the politicians knew about the problem with infant formula way back in March and April. Why didn't they do anything? Um, as a food manufacturer, I'm like, well, what would they do exactly? They're not making it, and the company doesn't want to have contaminated product. So, what exactly is the public expecting in those type of situations?
Yeah. I mean, I think um, one of the things that we have to do as food safety professionals, and I think the food industry has to do a much better job of, is educating the public about how food is made, how it's distributed,
Mm-hmm.
so supply chains, because all of it's all intertwined. Um, also, about economies of scale,
Mhm.
because all those things have conspired here, right? You have several large, well, basically one large company
Uh-huh.
that makes most of the powdered infant formula, and not only that, they make it at one centralized plant, right? So if you then have a problem with that plant and it has to shut down, um, you've got a big problem. And that's
Right.
essentially what happened, right? Abbott, their Michigan plant, I think the largest powdered infant formula plant in the U.S. and I think one of the largest in the world, um, had to shut down. So now you've got a major problem, um, and it takes time to solve that problem. Find it out, and then in their case, bacteria called Chronobacter, well known to cause potential issues in powdered infant formula. So now you've got to clean the plant, make sure it's no longer there. Then you have to restart the plant. So this is where the problem, I think, has come. And it really, I think the pandemic has also um, affected that, because there's problems getting ingredients used. We all know how the pandemic has disrupted global supply chains.
Mhm.
And I think it's really laid bare just how fragile our supply chains actually are. And
Yeah.
this whole idea of just in time production, which, everybody thought was the way to do things, right? Because it decreases the need for storage of product and all the problems that come with that.
Yeah.
Apparently, it turns out that perhaps that may not be the best way to do things,
Mhm.
given certainly during times of major global disruption like what we're seeing. So I think the problems with the powdered infant formula are multifaceted, but also, um, it's a good case study of what could happen in other um, food production sectors.
Right, and I think that that's a perfect segue into the webinar I'm doing next week on Wednesday, and Trace Gains is sponsoring this, so thank you to Trace Gains around enhanced traceability, because it's been a significant period of time now, right? Well over a year, where FDA came out with their guidance on enhanced traceability, and they're really talking about what we're talking about right now, is that when something does happen, everything that we're designed to do within traceability on these products when we're trying to find an issue is forward looking, right? So I'm the food manufacturer. I know where all my ingredients come from, and I know where I shipped it to. And I can track that stuff all day long. But after that point in time, it gets murky, right? Because I send it to a distributor who sends it to a wholesaler who sends it to a jobber who consolidates it on a truckload that goes to a small grocery store in Michigan, right? And tracking that is really, really hard. And FDA understands this acutely because they're trying to go backwards through a system that was designed to go forwards. And so FDA says, holy crap, we have this issue with Lucky Charms. We need to find out where this stuff came from and where it went and all these type of things. And they're trying to go backwards through the system, through all these distributors and everything else. And they're going, oh my God, this is nuts. We need to get directly to that first receiver who has that documentation so that we can quickly respond. So FDA came out with this guidance paper and essentially did a meta-analysis of food risk and came up with these categories of things that they're most worried about and saying, hey guys, you need to do this. But from an industry standpoint, I haven't seen a whole lot of movement on that. So I'd be curious in the comments here as well to see if people have seen any movement on that.
Yeah, and over the years, there's been you know various approaches postulated to solve this. Blockchain,
Mm-hmm.
I think, has been one of the latest ones. But the problem with these, leaving aside the technical difficulties with implementing that, which I think has been completely glossed over. I don't think it's as easy as people have made it out to be.
Right.
Um, but leaving that for a second, the one thing it cannot address is the industry willingness to do that, right? So there has to be a willingness on the part of the industry and individual companies to introduce these systems. Without that,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. We could have the best technology, the best traceability technology available, and without it, there's no without people's willingness, it will never be used. Simple things that could have happened years ago. Um, Simply digitizing one's records.
Hmm.
That I mean, that's we've had the technology to be able to do that for years, decades. Still today, we see there's problems and people searching records by hand, and
Hmm.
all kinds of things. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed is how do we affect behavioral change
Right, and
in
that's a huge point, right? In that, unless it can be demonstrated, hey, what's in this for me, it's going to be really hard to move people.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting too, right? Because we have all these different issues and new product categories that are out that are introducing new risk, right? So there's all these different plant-based foods. There's cell cultured products that are being grown up and things like this that are really amazing technology that are introducing new risk. And if you're making a plant-based meat product, it's not meat, right? What are the risks that go along with that? You can't treat it the same. So you're running it through that same supply chain, but what are the new risks that are associated with that? Are there any type of emerging pathogens or things of this nature that may be inherent to those products? It's important and it's incumbent upon that manufacturer. It's their responsibility to figure these things out.
Yeah. uh, I think I think that's a very astute comment, and I think when we talk about emerging food safety risks, I think many of them will come from these new foods. You mentioned plant-based meats. One of the potential concerns with plant-based meats um, is appears to be allergies
Mm.
and the presence of allergens. For example, pea proteins
Uh-huh.
um, that are used in some of these highly processed meat substitutes could actually trigger peanut allergies in some people.
Wow.
So then, of course, we have um, new proteins new like uh, plant-based proteins that are being used. Some of them in combination. Nobody's really studied the long-term um, effect of repeated exposure
Mm.
to that. So could new allergies
Ooh.
could we be introducing new allergies? Then of course on the food safety arena, these are highly processed products. So are we, you know, is there concern about foreign matter, glass, metal, things like that? Because these products are so highly processed that could get in. So, and then of course we have the microbiological um, concerns. It's referred to as meat, but as you've said, it's not meat.
Yeah.
So people treating these plant-based meats, I say in quotations, as we would treat animal-derived meat, because um, I think that that's not advisable. We have no idea, for example, um, should these plant-based products be cooked, to the same temperature as animal meat? On the other hand, are people thinking, well, it's not animal meat, so I will just leave it out on the countertop,
Yeah.
which could introduce its own set of food safety risks, bacteria that are present in those products that would then grow um, because it's left at room temperature. So I think there's a lot, as you say, there's a lot of very interesting questions, food safety questions to ask around these new plant-based so-called meat products, or lab-based cultured meat products. And going forward, I think we're going to need to have really robust risk assessments done
Hmm.
to really determine the safety of these products.
Right. Well, and I think that really kind of hits on what the major challenges in the food industry is, that if you're working in food quality and food safety and things like that, you have to be constantly thinking about not necessarily what's happening, but trying to predict new trends and avoiding those in the future. And that's really hard to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's why, and then this is something that I advocate a lot, right? Is that you need to really keep up on these trends and understand what's going on. And one of the things, Larry, that I put together is that there's a new kind of platform out there called Locals, locals.com, where you can then have a platform where you can share information. So I use that to post recalls and other information. It's a free service, right? And so as recalls come out, I go on there 2 or 3 times a week and send those out to everybody who's on that list so that they can kind of keep up to date on what's going on. There's also a membership area in there as well too, where we're posting videos and more thoughts from me and things like this on what's going on to kind of get a little bit of insider baseball on that side too. One of the things I always use to coach my quality managers on is you need to know what's going on with food safety more than anybody who comes to your plant. That includes FDA, that includes auditors, everybody, right? Because if you do, you're going to be confident in what you're doing, and that confidence is going to come through, and they'll know that you pay close attention to food safety. And that perception is one of the most important things out there as well.
Absolutely, and it also is very important to building an effective food safety culture in the respective, food processing plant.
Yeah, because part of this, right, and this is something that I talk about quite a bit as well too, is there's the technical aspects of what we do, but the people side is just as important, right? Because as we talked about in this conversation today quite a bit, and as Austin mentioned in the comments, this is about behaviors, right? Of what are people doing to manage these behaviors, right? So normally we're talking about the behavior within companies and how we're managing things within our control. But today we've kind of broadened our perspective back a little bit to realize that this includes the consumers as well, right? What are their behaviors? What are their perceptions? And how are they reacting to what they see in the marketplace, which is huge.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally with food safety, we've left out the consumers.
Yeah.
I think that's because the thinking is, from a food production perspective, we cannot control what consumers do. Once they buy a product, we're not in the house, we can't control. But I've always thought it's curious because we know that most cases of foodborne illness actually occur in the house.
True.
So I've always thought that it would be wise, and this comes back to what I said earlier about, I think the food industry really needs to modernize how they view the whole food production and consumption continuum and really begin to educate consumers.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about new foods anyways, new emerging foods. People need to
Yeah.
be educated about how to handle those foods. And so I think that there needs to be a large consumer education program, and that consumers should not be viewed as food production should not be viewed as ending once it's packaged and shipped out to retail, but rather the whole continuum right through the consumption should be viewed.
It's a good point. Yeah, when the whole COVID thing first hit, to help people out, I did a little video on how to, once you've been out in the world and potentially exposing yourself, how do you return to your home safely? So I used a lot of the principles of, how to use hand washing, how do you set up a station, how do you bring your materials into the house? Because at that point in time, right, nobody knew what was going on. It's like, wow, this virus could be on boxes. It could be, it's everywhere, right? So I cover off on all of those different type of things and used my food industry experience and clean room experience working in medical device to kind of say, here's some really good steps on things that you can do in your house with the things that you already have. And that was one of the most viewed videos I've done. And it was fun, and it's a good way to share information with the general public. So there's definitely tools out there to do those type of things.
Yeah.
So perfect. Yeah. So really interesting conversation, Larry. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
So with that, guys, we're going to close out for today. And one of the things I always like to do on this chat, because recognition for these type of activities, I think, is important. So thank you to everybody for joining us today and participating in this, right? Because this is how we all get better at food safety, is sharing this information and this knowledge and being able to talk and interact with experts like Dr. Goodridge and get their perspective real time on things that are happening in the world right now. Because if you're not doing that with food safety, if you're not constantly growing your knowledge base in food safety, you're going to fall behind. and it will happen really, really fast. So you need to keep up on these things. And in your company, if you're responsible for food safety, you need to then take this information and share it and become an advocate within those companies for these type of activities so that we can all get better in these areas and look at these emerging risks and need to do things. I mean, we didn't even talk about, because we ran out of time here, the new risks around supply chain and how the war in Ukraine has impacted all these type of activities. So think about that a little bit as a takeaway. So with that, we're going to close out the chat for today. Of course, we'll be back here next week at the same time. So Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time for the next food safety chat. And we'll be here on LinkedIn, and we will see you there then. Oh, and also, don't forget, guys. So next Wednesday morning is the Trace Gains webinar on enhanced traceability. So come and check that out. Get my take on the latest findings around enhanced traceability and what you should be doing in your operations to prepare for this. Because whether you're doing it or not, it's coming, right? So food safety doesn't wait for anybody. So make sure that you're up to speed. So we'll see you next week. And once again, Larry, thank you very much. Great conversation. I always love talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Bye.